Hey, everybody. I am absolutely honored to have my first ever member of the US military, US Space Force, in an interview. Jason Lowery, you are a legend in your own right in a very short window of time. Thank you for being here with me today. How are you
Thanks,
doing?
James. Pleasure. Good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for making the time. I know you've been doing the circuit since what, October, November, running around.
Yeah, yeah. I got approval, and by December, I was able to start speaking formally and publicly. And so I've been trying to kind of balance school and talking, and also doing the methodology for my thesis. So yeah, this is one of probably many.
Well, it's excellent that you are here. Could you tell the audience in 60 seconds a little bit about yourself and how you fell into Bitcoin and the whole Space Force and MIT and everything else? You've got a fascinating background.
Yeah. Okay. So I am an astronautical engineer in the U.S. Space Force, one of the founding company of officers. I am also a National Defense Fellow at MIT. So the military will nominate engineers to go to schools like MIT or other schools to learn the latest and greatest. My current assignment is to understand the national strategic implications of emerging technology. And I am doing that by researching Bitcoin. So I'm going to school full time. My like literal assignment is school. I'm learning engineering, I'm learning management, and learning business, but I'm also researching the national strategic military implications of technologies to include Bitcoin, but primarily just proof of work.
That's excellent. And it couldn't be a more timely time for there's just I've been mind blown. I've been watching Bitcoin carefully since about 2017. Bit of a latecomer, but very, I don't want to say obsessed, but fascinated by the technology. And, I'm a finance guy hardcore for more than 3 decades. And just over the last, between the C19 situation that kicked in late 2019, early 2020, we saw 10 years of change happen in 12 months. I believe also in the first 10 to 12 weeks of 2022, we've seen 10 years of fiscal, monetary, great reset, fourth turning change happen in an extremely short window. Like way beyond my wildest dreams that, I always say all roads lead to Bitcoin. But what do you think? Do you believe there is such thing as a fourth turning? What do you believe about this crazy debt cycle we're in? And do you believe something could trigger a reset? And in what time frame? I know it's a very loaded question.
Yeah, yeah. So I I don't really choose to look at Bitcoin too much in its monetary light. Like obviously, I did for when I first invested, but at least for this sake of my research, I'm trying to take a very disciplined approach, a very first principles based approach to studying Bitcoin and its strategic implications, its national strategic implications, and I found that actually viewing Bitcoin as a monetary system and trying to predict debt cycles or great reset monetary reset cycles is actually more complicated than just simply viewing it um, as what will I think become a defense system for all countries who would want to prevent or reduce the attack surface on their sovereign wealth. And so one of my thesis is called mutually assured preservation. And that's a direct call to mutually assured destruction. The argument is effectively that countries are going to reach a stalemate where they can no longer have zero trust and egalitarian control or settle disputes over monetary systems anymore. And countries are basically being forced into a position where they have to subscribe to a nuclear power that could effectively denial of service attack them by if they choose to follow their network. And so mutually assured preservation means we by the invention of Bitcoin, by the invention of an electric proof of work network, we were able to actually restore zero trust and egalitarian control over a monetizable property. And so we've effectively created a new Schelling point where it will be in every country's best interest not to subscribe to a nuclear power that could denial of service attack them, but to simply subscribe to a non-sovereign monetary system to protect their national treasuries. And so I see Bitcoin very much as a new Schelling point in warfare, not a new monetary system resets, because in my opinion, monetary resets are high time preference. The value proposition of Bitcoin is less attractive as a monetary system reset than it is as a wholly new form of property defense for agrarian societies to subscribe to. I know that was a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very interesting angle. And so I'm trying to figure out where to go next because so many different channels. So let's go back to you talked about attack surface, etc. But do you think there is a single biggest threat to Bitcoin out there? Like, if you were Michael Saylor, for example, and you had a large bag, what would keep you awake at night?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it's super simple. If you want to understand what the biggest strategic risk to Bitcoin is, look at what the biggest strategic risk to any country that needs to defend itself against a denial of service attack. And all you have to do to create a strategic risk, a systemic risk to someone who's trying to hold their physical property, is to convince the population to lay down their arms, is to convince the population that it's too energy inefficient to have a military, or some other thing. And so once you have convinced people that proof of work, something like proof of work is unfriendly for the environment, you are literally disarming your defense system over Bitcoin. And so that's the systemic risk. That's the biggest risk in my mind, is we can't have this continuing argument of people who don't understand the security structure of this technology, and they either effectively destroy Bitcoin's value proposition by convincing it to disarm itself, by convincing it to stop using energy, or they pivot to what is effectively a new denial of serviceable network just because it's more energy intense or energy efficient.
And we had a close
Does that?
shave. Yeah, we had a close shave with the European Union as well this week.
Yeah, and it was close. So
Yeah,
that is a huge systemic threat. We can't afford to let these people do this. As a country, if you convince your own population that the energy that they spend to defend their private property is bad, then you get into the same strategic Schelling point that has already happened multiple times in agrarian society, where the population, or where people like Emperor Constantine turns down the opportunity to adopt cannons or adopt torpedoes or adopt airplanes or adopt any other new technological Schelling point that protects their private property.
yeah, it's interesting. There was some people that were very concerned in Europe about this, and they thought it'd be sending them back to the dark ages if this type of ban would come into place, because blockchain, etc., is changing the world, and it would be a real shock. So, with that, and these type of changes and this new monetary asset as we go forward, there was also a lot of change over the past week or so with the potential of the US dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency. A lot of it is brought about by geopolitical events. Would it be strategically advantageous for the US to promote Bitcoin for international trade instead of the dollar as an option to the dollar?
So I guess there's one point of clarification that I should make. If the United States or if EU were to ban Bitcoin, Bitcoin would be fine, probably. The countries that banned them are the ones that would really miss out. Yeah. And so there is a distinction between, but Bitcoin itself grows stronger the more energy it uses to defend itself. And the more powerful, literally the more powerful it can become in terms of watts or joules per second. And so you also, just like when China kicked out its mining network, that made China suffer, but it also did make Bitcoin suffer because its hash rate dropped pretty substantially. So while Bitcoin will survive the country, but it still like suffers, but the country themselves truly suffer by kicking this technology out. Now, to your new question about would it be advantageous for the United States to consider adding Bitcoin, especially to protect itself under the threat that people might exit the United States network, the United States monetary network. I actually warned Senator Loomis directly about this when the United States was first talking about taking countries off of SWIFT, because you have to remember that a monetary network obeys Metcalfe's law. So just as the network grows disproportionately to the number of users, it grows non-linearly as the number of users grows linearly. Well, if you kick people off, its value will collapse non-linearly just as the users leave linearly. So so as the architects of any network, but especially a monetary system network, you must understand that you are harming yourself by forcing users out of it, because your value is derived from the number of users using your network, obviously. And so this creates one of those strategic situations where we have to start looking long term. I have presidential advisors of foreign countries in my classes at MIT, and they're watching this and they're telling me, I'm watching this, and I'm realizing that our sovereign treasury isn't ours. It's only ours insofar as the United States allows us to have it. And obviously Russia and China feel this way, and obviously they're going to reprice their exports in a different currency to get off this denial of service monetary network. But the real question is for the people in these third-party countries who now realize, well, okay, even if I go to the new system that Russia or China create, I don't solve the denial of service vulnerability that I now have. Yep. So every country watching these elephants fighting are realizing, I got to get out of this grass. Yep. And they're going to hedge. If they're rational, they're going to find a non-sovereign monetary system to subscribe to. And when they do that, their capital is flying out of our monetary system. And so the United States, I believe, and what I'll argue, is that we need to posture ourselves on the other side of that exit door, so that when that capital does fly, we at least stand to be able to recapture some of that purchasing power. So I think it is critical and enormous, and no other nation would benefit more than the United States if we were to start adding Bitcoin to our sovereign treasury, or doing whatever we can to strengthen our monetary network with this non-sovereign property effectively.
And they need to do that as well, because if you look at many countries, not just the US, but any country that is beyond 77% debt to GDP ratio, they're beyond the tipping point. They can never get back. It's too late. It's game over. If the US was considered an individual or a corporation, they'd be bankrupt through and through and would have to reset. And that writing is on the wall. So I really like what you say, adding Bitcoin to the Treasury Reserve. But what's stopping the Treasury Reserve printing money and buying Bitcoin? And would that impact things, or would that mean they'd be like shooting themselves in the foot, excuse the pun, and would bring down the value of Bitcoin if they the value of the dollar if they admitted that?
So what we need to step up one level and realize that we're talking about Bitcoin as a monetary network and not as a weapon system. At the end of the day, Bitcoin is literally just a set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do. And every way we treat it, every way we try to understand the complexity of this software, we do it almost non-intuitively. So like people just take it for granted that Bitcoin is strictly just a monetary system. They don't even consider any other different form of abstraction that could equally or better describe these set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do. So if you frame Bitcoin as a monetary system, then these questions are rational, and we can ask, well, obviously, the treasury is in a good place to add this to their balance sheet, but would that be, would that like detract or decrease the United States hegemony? But if you take a totally different approach, if you totally remember, this is just software, so we can take different abstractions and try to understand the complexity of this technology. If we take a different approach and we frame Bitcoin as a weapon system, meaning as a hunk of a whole bunch of metal that exists to convert energy into property defense, that has the means and capability to physically stop denial of service attacks, just like weapons can, then you realize you have to look at any time a new weapon system shelling point emerged in history. And it has never been true that when a new defense system emerges, that anything but you must have that new technology makes sense. So this question that should the treasury adopt it as a monetary system, blah, 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 that to me is not actually the right conversation that policymakers should ask themselves. The correct policy that people should be talking about is when guns emerged, could you afford not to own guns? When torpedoes emerged, could you afford not to own torpedoes? When nukes emerged, could you afford not to have nukes? When airplanes with battle carriers, anytime a new property defense technology emerges that sovereign entities can adopt to preserve their treasury reserve asset, there isn't a condition where the new shelling point isn't simply everyone must have that technology. So this is the Nash equilibrium. So just like the question of whether or not we should hold Bitcoin or not is like literally whether or not the United States should subscribe to this new, literally more powerful property defense network. If we don't, it doesn't really matter what we do. It matters what everyone else does. And obviously, the disenfranchised countries, obviously the countries that are most vulnerable to denial of service attacks, are going to adopt this thing. And when they do, it doesn't matter what the United States thinks about it. We can't ban them from not adopting this technology or adopting it. So you have to position yourself in this way.
This is so head is spinning a little bit. So how can Bitcoin be used as a strategic defense network when the price has been easily manipulated? And tied into that, you mentioned Bitcoin as well can be weaponized in war, but also for peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky, right? There's a dichotomy there. So the price of Bitcoin hasn't changed. It's 100 million Satoshis, and it stays 100 million Satoshis. Period. If countries are exiting the United States dollar, like literally exiting it, and then putting Satoshis on their balance sheet, they don't care what the USD equivalent of that. So we have to start imagining a future where the base layer collateral reserve asset, the thing that is doing the final clearance between sovereign nations, the USD denominated price of that pristine denial of service proof asset is irrelevant. It will become irrelevant. But until that time, there's this awkward transition period where that kind of question does make sense. So we just kind of have to start thinking about that. So in my opinion, this price volatility is just a temporary fleeting thing that no one is going to care about in 50 to 100 years. What was your other question? Is it peace? Is it not peace?
Yeah, peace, war. How can Bitcoin be weaponized in war, or is it ultimately a driver of peace? If that is the asset that can't be quashed, you can't get rid of the nodes on the network, etc., the hashing facilities can be dispersed widely. You can't
Yeah.
ICBM them to to the end of the earth.
So war doesn't. I don't suspect there will be any pure replacement to war in human. Like there hasn't been for 4 billion years. It's probably not going to change. Hasn't been for humans in 200,000 years. Hasn't been for agrarian society for 6,000 years. So war ain't going away. And I've never tried to make the argument that Bitcoin will end war. My argument is Bitcoin will supplement war. It will become the most often used, the most preferred way to defend our property rights, to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over monetizable property. Because the alternative is stalemate now that nukes exist. Yeah. See what I'm saying here? And we're literally seeing this on the world stage right now. Yes. The alternative to Bitcoin is nuclear stalemated countries that can denial of service attack each other off each other's network. So the preferred war, the proxy war, the act of sapiens engaging in power projection competition to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over monetary property, to find a way to physically stop people from denial of service attacking them, to find a way to harm attackers, what we call war, that primary form, I believe, is being transposed digitally now. And instead of instead of humans in the loop, machines with humans in the loop engaging in power projection competitions, we're just going to have machines engaging in electronic power competitions. And by the way, this is nothing new. Tesla, Edison, Ford, they were predicting these types of things. And I'm already in a military branch that does non-lethal power projection competitions. It's just drones versus drones in orbit. So the difference between Space Force and Bitcoin is literally you just take the drones out of orbit, you put them on a rack, and you have them engage in a computational firepower competition, electric power projection competition. And I say those words deliberately because this is literally how Satoshi Nakamoto described hashing. He literally described it as computational firepower between good guys and bad guys. And so, but to that end, obviously, we're still going to need some type of, we'll call it legacy, the old-fashioned way of kinetic power projection to protect the physical entities of the Bitcoin infrastructure that have mass. So the electricity, the power grids, the internet grids, the mining networks themselves, those will still have to be defended using war. And if anyone would dare to try to attack that physically, they would have to be defended physically. Does that make sense? So it supplements, Bitcoin supplements war. It doesn't replace it. But imagine how much less return on investment there would be for war if the spoils of war didn't exist, or right? So like there wasn't any land, monetized land or monetized property to physically seize anymore. It's all protected by a wall of encryption. And the only way you can earn it is to be productive, essentially. Yep. You can't raise an army to take it. So you have to back up and you have to look at the complex emergent properties. And if the complex emergent properties of warfare change from a kinetic to an electric power competition, then you get away from blood, you get away from the side effects of rubble and destruction, and you go towards a world where energy becomes cheaper, you have more infrastructure, you have dramatically less return on investment for belligerents to begin with. And that is a beautiful future. But you have to understand Bitcoin as a weapon system to make a coherent argument about it. Because if you don't, then like you can't explain how Bitcoin can end war or replace war or reduce war without showing how it's functionally equivalent to the mechanisms that do war now. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great point. So you mentioned the term hegemony. US hegemony clearly is declining. that acceleration that I mentioned is happening fast. The question is, with the importance of the US dollar and the hegemony disappearing by the day, was a single global reserve currency an unnatural phenomenon out of the gate, or was it forced through war and weapons? By controlling oil supply, petrodollar, etc. How do you view that part of the world, and do you see it dwindling fast?
Look up the world reserve currencies that have existed for the last several hundred years, and then map that to the military superpowers that existed at the same time.
Direct correlation.
And look at the correlation.
Yep.
So we've kind of established that if you're going to monetize an asset, like if you're going to monetize land or you're going to monetize whatever, it's in your best interest. It's in the world's best interest to have the best defended money. So humans naturally tend to favor the reserve with the best defense. You want the property with the best property defense. You don't want to own land in certain part of the world right now, because you can virtually guarantee that you're not going to have access to your money, right? They can't defend that money. So in my opinion, there's like the last 50 years is just a continuation of a long history of correlations. Can't prove the causation, but it's like clear that there's a correlation. And so if we switch to a new system, if like Bitcoin becomes the new world reserve currency, then in my opinion, we're still following the same trend. Because if you view Bitcoin as a weapon system, a military defense industrial complex, it's still true that the entity, the group of people that control the most powerful defense system, also have the world reserve currency.
Yep.
It's not a sovereign currency anymore. It just goes from a state military to a non-sovereign military. And so we go from a state world currency to a non-state world currency, but the correlation and the trend remains. And the United States is in a really beautiful position to place itself at the top of to benefit the most in this new paradigm. We just have to convince enough people to see this potential future. I don't know if it's right, but I know the consequences of if I'm right and we don't do anything.
Yeah, you eloquently put what most politicians have no clue about. And you listen to, I won't mention any names, but you listen to European politicians, American politicians, Canadian politicians talking about this stuff. They clearly haven't done the 100 hours or 1,000 hours to understand it. But to what extent do you believe you could get up there? Well, if you look at all the changes going on right now, I think Texas is a dramatic example of how they are embracing hash power. I think by my forecast, Texas itself will own between 20 and 25% of the hash rate by the end of the year. That's just one state. And, there's been talk in the past, they want their own independence and everything else. That could change the game. That could become the most powerful country in the world by just being a state if they own all the hash power. So do the politicians, the ones that are pivoting to Bitcoin, do you think they understand that and they're smarter than they let on? Or do they still need to be educated?
Well,
we spoke to Senator Loomis, for example. She gets
it. Yeah. So some of that, I think, is just people playing to their strengths. Texas is a monster energy producer.
Yeah.
So, and the way Bitcoin works is it literally pays you to smoke your own crack. So, like if you produce a lot of energy, then obviously the incentives are going to align really well to be paid handsomely for producing that energy. But I do think some people are starting to understand this. I don't think a lot of people really fully understand that in addition to being an economic superpower by being a first mover, I don't think they understand that you also make yourself a military power by being a first mover. They don't fully understand the national strategic military implications of this technology. If you have if Texas is effectively raising a commercial hash force, and Texas will if they start buying Bitcoin, they will have a treasury reserve asset that literally can't, like, that entire superpowers, global nuclear superpowers, can't denial of service attack.
Well, technically they could. If all the hash rate was in Texas, a couple of ICBMs could take it out, no?
Yeah, but so that's why it gets cool. So if you look at the Bitcoin technology, what is Bitcoin made out of? It's made out of TCP/IP, which is what DARPA created to make nuclear hardened communications. It's made out of SHA-256, an NSA protocol, a military encryption protocol. It's made out of software that emerged out of Bell Laboratories, which did a lot of work in defense. And so the core critical enabling technologies behind Bitcoin are literally nuclear hardened technologies. They're like literally designed to be resistant against nuclear strikes. And that's just scaling. But to your point, yeah, like, I mean, it's feasible that there could be some massive kinetic strike against the infrastructure that supports Bitcoin. And they might be able to do that and raise a bunch of hash forces on their own to try to 51% attack the network while it's weak. And those are super valid points, but that is a conversation that very few people are even talking about yet. That's something that I'm starting to think about, because my job is to posture the country to be a superpower in 20 and 30 years. I don't know if politicians fully understand this yet.
Good. And in fact, related to that, imagine I stick you in front of the Senate tomorrow, okay? And you've completed your thesis, and your job is to make the case for Bitcoin to the US Senate within 20 minutes. Do you think they get it, or how do you think they would react?
Yeah, that question is literally the entire point of my research here.
Oh.
It's like that's the only thing that I'm trying to figure out. And so my mission is, how do I make the most compelling argument to US policymakers to shape the correct policy on this? And it gets really, really difficult when you talk about software for the reasons that we said earlier, because you can look at software using different abstractions. And if you look at it like a monetary system, you're going to draw very different conclusions and policy than if you look at it like anything else. But I also know history, and I also know that politicians or policymakers tend to have bipartisan support of defense. I also know that traditional defense systems, expensive defense systems like GPS, went for 25 years unfunded because the scientists and the engineers and the developers couldn't convince Congress that it was worth the money to build this massive multi-billion-dollar constellation of atomic clocks in space. It wasn't until we framed GPS as a national strategic nuclear military weapon system that we finally got the bipartisan support. So once Congress knew that we could not mutually assure the destruction of the Soviet Union, did they finally actually pump in the money to support this? And so when I first started, remember when I started calling this mutually assured preservation 7 months ago, I knew this. I knew the best way to convince Congress to get bipartisan support from policymakers and to do it in a way that just doesn't confuse people is probably to take the national strategy defense angle. Now I just have to find a coherent, congruent, empirically valid argument for that. And so what I've been doing with Twitter and podcasts and stuff is what's called grounded methodology, where I test that with people. I test ideas, I test concepts, I let them yell at me and attack me and try to tell me where I'm wrong. And that's just making me stronger and stronger until I can get to the point where I can build a convincing argument to policymakers. And I think I'm almost there.
So we're each other's guinea pigs a little bit. I love that. All right, let's throw a couple of other guinea pig questions at you. This is interesting. So imagine a US adversary or any whoever they may be out there in the world, and they all of a sudden would admit to very, very large holdings of Bitcoin. Could its value become tarnished? Could Bitcoin become enemy of the state if that was the case?
So let's rewind to the year 1400, and you're the Roman Empire, or maybe 1423 or something like that. And the Ottomans announced that they just adopted this cannon technology that Constantinople turned down. So they're saying, we now hold a large position of cannon technology. We now hold a new large position of this technology that converts energy to property defense. Does it make sense to does the value proposition of cannons go down? Yeah. Or does it go up fast? And so what we're effectively, if they were to announce that, what they would effectively be announcing is, from now on, we're going to defend our sovereign wealth with electricity.
Yeah.
That doesn't make the value proposition of electric property defense go down. That just makes it skyrocket. And so we have to make sure our policymakers don't let them do that first. We have to, and they screwed up. They just burnt their ships. China just kicked out their miners. And Russia and China are collaborating possibly on a digital yuan. So they don't understand this game theory yet. And so we have this perfect opportunity where we could take advantage of it. It would be tragic to let them make the first move.
Do you believe the main theory behind China banning the miners was not to ban Bitcoin for the digital yuan, but because the grid was so overloaded and couldn't take any more power usage?
I doubt it was because it couldn't take any more power usage. Okay. Let's go back to what's the number one threat to Bitcoin. It's your government convincing you that it uses too much power, that it projects too much power, that it's too powerful. That's exactly what you would.
Yeah.
If you want to disarm your citizens, that's exactly what you tell them. So I have a feeling China's just doing what China does. And when they see a new merchant class emerge, just like they did in the 1400s, when they had treasury fleets and ships that dwarfed the size of what Columbus was sailing on, I have a feeling that China is being threatened by the emerging richness and power, literally power, of their merchant class. And they've nipped that in the bud, especially knowing that they're thinking about rolling out a digital yuan and possibly repricing exports of countries in digital yuan to compete directly with the United States dollar.
Or the fact that, I believe firmly that the Chinese simply don't like it because it's so hard to control.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
Exactly.
And that's such a great advantage to us.
Yeah.
Like strategically, for them to shoot themselves directly in the foot, for them to believe that they can ban other people from using Bitcoin. They'll literally just stop and won't accept this new property defense technology that will probably take off is so special for us. It creates such a beautiful window of opportunity, but authoritarianism works both ways. Just as quickly as they ban Bitcoin, they could be like, nope, never mind. We now see that we could really screw over, or we could really posture ourselves to be like the number one for the next 1,000 years by jumping all into Bitcoin. They can use their authoritarianism to pivot back really quickly. And so the question is, how long is it going to take the United States to recognize what we're talking about versus how long it's going to take China, Russia to recognize it, knowing that China, Russia has the authoritarian capability to pivot hard back into it faster than we could, because we've got a lot of, we got that democracy. It's good, but it's slow.
In fact, Putin has openly hinted at that a few times. We have the electricity, we have the technology, we've got the people, we can do this. So it was kind of interesting.
A total 180.
Yeah,
exactly. Total 180 from the position that they had taken earlier. So they are starting to pick it up, and that should be something on every policymaker's minds right now.
Okay, let's play a little more game theory. How does a government embrace Bitcoin without triggering a run on their own sovereign currency? And what is the best way for one to prepare for the day that fiat is declared dead or when the Great Reset occurs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you what I've read and heard and what people have suggested to me, because I asked these questions. These are part of my theory development exercises. One argument is the government should buy a crap ton of it and not tell anybody. So like clandestine or covert buying of mass treasuries, treasury reserve of Bitcoin. But I don't know how much they could hide that anyways.
No.
Like you can't build like a multi-trillion-dollar Bitcoin position. Maybe you could if you're like disguising it through the exchanges or something.
You can track the FBI wallets.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but like the government could make a deal with NYDIG or Coinbase or whatever. So that's the scary part. Like the scary part is the POTUS just passes an executive order and says, I hereby nationalize all Bitcoin in NYDIG, controlled by NYDIG, controlled by Coinbase. That is now the United States' property. That wouldn't be out of the ordinary. It's already happened.
Yeah, after what we saw north of the border.
Well, so that was a flat out denial of service attack for a different reason, but yeah, still denial of service attack. But like, look at Executive Order 6102. Like people's gold was physically from now on, the United States owns all your gold. So that's one way to do it. That is one way that I very much hope doesn't happen. But just in case it does, I encourage everyone, not your keys, not your Bitcoin, hold your own Bitcoin in case we face that future. They could buy it clandestinely, or they just support open policy for American businesses to use this technology more, and then to use it as legal tender, to tax it, right? Take it through taxes, or there's like a whole host of other ways that they could do this. They could create a CBDC that's backed by Bitcoin, with exchangeable, and so and maybe like make the CBDC non-taxable as legal currency, and then keep the Bitcoin as taxable. Like there's so many different ways that it could go down. There's good ways, there's bad ways, but what I don't think is possible to argue rationally is whether or not we should buy it. Because it just doesn't make sense from every angle that I take, even if it represents a direct threat to their United States USD hegemony. You buy it as insurance against its own success.
Yep.
Right? You don't have to worry about Bitcoin destroying your hegemony if you own the most Bitcoin, especially if you have the ability to print your money to buy the Bitcoin and you could drive up the cost and make it too expensive for anyone else to have Bitcoin. Yep. So it's like, maybe that's it. Maybe you just print to oblivion, buy a shit ton of Bitcoin, and price everyone out of the market before they can get in.
Interesting. And related to that, triggers another question is, from a national security perspective, what is the relative importance for citizens, for example, of the US to hold Bitcoin, governments to hold Bitcoin, private institutions to hold Bitcoin, publicly traded Bitcoin miners to hold Bitcoin? How do you see the relative importance across those 4 to 5 different categories?
In general, I think the more diverse and decentralized both ownership and hashing is, the better. So if you want to maximize your sovereignty, own your own keys, control your own keys, and run a hash device, an ASIC, to defend your ability to basically physically prevent denial of service attack. That's the best way. Now, how you separate it, it's hard to know. What's the ideal way? I don't know. And depending on your customer, like it's super easy for like a single person to manage their own keys, but how do you set up like that same situation for a huge organization or a country themselves, even with multi-sig? Like the technology isn't all quite there yet. And so, but yeah, just as a rule of thumb, the more people own and control their own keys and run their own hashing, the better.
Yeah. And putting El Salvador aside, obviously they used the dollar. They didn't have their own sovereign currency. Why would nations want to actually adopt Bitcoin? Because it takes away the power of unlimited money printing. Is that not, again, shooting themselves in the foot by adopting the
Yeah.
Bitcoin standard?
So the easy way to say this is it ain't an option. This isn't a negotiation. Bitcoin doesn't care if it's inconvenient for you.
Yeah.
It's so the other way to put it is a mountain doesn't care about an airplane flying towards it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is the responsibility of the bankers. Every time a bank decides to print money, they're screwing over their users. They're debasing their users. Every time they surveil it, they screw over their users. Every time they denial service attack users, they screw over their users. They're creating all these kinds of reasons for users to exit. So what they're effectively doing, because the only thing they can control is their own monetary system, they can't control Bitcoin. If you're doing all these things to your monetary network's users, you're effectively pointing the airplane directly at the mountain and then blaming the mountain for you losing the convenience of printing your money. It's like the mountain doesn't care. And it's not the mountain's fault if you point your airplane directly at it and crash into it. So this world where we could even have the luxury of printing money ad infinitum is like new. It hasn't been around for that much compared to the history of agrarian society, the history of sapiens, and the history of the act of animals projecting power to defend their access to private property. War and new technologies in war have a tendency to be inconvenient to the incumbents. And like when Constantine was talking to his officers, he was telling them, don't worry, your swords and shields are fully sufficient and will protect you in battle, as the cannons were ringing out and blowing down their walls. It was pretty inconvenient for Constantine to get the walls of Constantinople shot down. He's the one that chose not to adopt cannons.
Yeah. So it's, again,
So
more game theory in play. So
the game theory is Bitcoin is not a negotiation. The Nash equilibrium, the Schelling point, every arrow points to you buy it ASAP.
Yep. I love that. You hit on Henry Ford earlier, and I can't remember what he said in 1920 something, but he mapped out the correlation between money and energy as kind of directly proportional. I can't remember his exact quote, but I heard it a year ago and it was amazing. I wish I could remember now.
He basically said, I remember what he said. He said, if you take away the control, then you take away the war, you end the war. And so his idea was to monetize energy instead of gold, to take away the control over gold from banks, knowing that control structure over gold effectively financed war or incentivized war. So as a measure to disincentivize kinetic power projection to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over gold, if you did it over energy, if you did it over a monetary property that doesn't have mass, then kinetic power projection, i.e. force against mass, is irrelevant. Yep. You can't achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over non-mass-based money using kinetic power projection. So he recognized that. Edison, who was literally standing right next to him when he said that quote, recognized it. And then Tesla, 30 years before, said the exact same thing and said that eventually national powers will be in a strategic stalemate. They will be so powerful, their weapons of war will be so powerful that there is no way to invade another country. And in that world, we would have to sit back and watch machines engage each other in a power competition. And so if you marry Ford's idea and Edison's idea with Tesla's idea, you realize that Bitcoin is the embodiment of that. That's the mind-blowing thing.
Exactly.
Not that that it's a new way, it's digital gold or like a new form of property. It's a new control structure over property, over monetary property that disincentivizes or obviates kinetic power projection.
Exactly. And I've been talking about kind of the PetroBitcoin equivalent to a PetroDollar, but do you find it fascinating the fact that with the recent seizing of reserves, etc., and then the move of other major powers to maybe pay for oil in Yuan instead of dollar, and maybe the correlation between energy and the monetary system that is Bitcoin all together. Do you see all these worlds colliding at once, and there will ultimately be a PetroBitcoin, for example, going forward, or will all energy be denominated in Bitcoin as we go forward, every joule?
So when you take away the base layer collateral, when you take away gold, and you have no peg to gold, people are going to find something else to monetize. They're going to monetize property. They're going to monetize mortgages. So promises, contracts themselves become monetized. That's why stocks go through the roof now. That's why you have, they're literally using stocks and equities as money itself. So to include also commodities, to include things like petroleum, which is also very closely linked to energy. So there is that interesting correlation. But the problem with petroleum is it has mass, which means you can control that mass using kinetic power projection, which means if you want to have disproportionate control over that mass-based petroleum, you should engage, you should fight, you should build militaries, and so that's the problem. With Bitcoin, you take all the beauty of the energy, of monetized energy, but then you remove its mass. And if you remove its mass, then kinetic power projection, the act of having to have people fight people kinetically in a human in the loop system where people die, that becomes totally pointless. There is no point, because you're not going to, your kinetic power projection isn't going to get your hands on this massless monetary energy. And so, yeah, I see them colliding, but I again see monetized petroleum as just a temporary thing. I think it's going to, if it's not Bitcoin, it'll be some other electricity-based currency, a monetized energy with a electric power projection game over it. It might not be Bitcoin specifically, but it's going to be a proof of work, probably cryptocurrency. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in this future where agrarian societies fight each other using electric power projection to establish and preserve zero trust and egalitarian control over massless monetary property, then how do we identify what that new what is effectively property defense as a service protocol or war protocol? What is that new war protocol? When cannons emerged, the new war protocol is we fight with cannons. When nukes emerged, the new war protocol is we fight with nukes. When electric power projection comes, when we start building ASICs and pumping energy into it to fight other ASICs in cyberspace to preserve zero trust and egalitarian control and to prevent denial of service attacks, the only thing that separates that from the new war protocol is simply how many countries adopt it. And it's already started. And so that's kind of the way I'm trying to look at it.
So is part of your charter, obviously, within the Space Force, it's to help the US become a leader and also help US citizens becoming a leader in this whole crypto world, crypto development? Is that part of your charter as you go forward?
Yeah, my whole job is to predict the future of warfare and build weapon systems and posture the United States to stay a superpower. So like when I was in the Air Force, at that time, it was clear that we needed machines that could convert energy into air defense, okay, to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over things in the air, okay, property in the air or the airspace itself. This was already true when both of us were born. It was already true for land when both of us were born. It was already true for Navy, for sea. So countries have been engaging in kinetic power projection competitions to preserve zero trust and egalitarian control over sea, land, and air. What was special about me is we started doing that for space. So we realized, okay, how are we going to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over space? Because the alternative is we just trust our neighbor not to denial service attack us from access to space. And so obviously we're not going to do that. So we have to fashion these machines to project power to preserve zero trust control over our access to space. Okay, we are watching live right now cyber property be born, a new form, a new domain, a new monetizable asset, and a new form of property. The question is, one, how do you establish zero trust and egalitarian control over that property? How do you physically prevent people from denial of service attacking you cyber property? So that's step number one. And that step is proof of work. And there will be no replacement to proof of work. And people are fooling themselves if they think there will ever be a replacement to proof of work for establishing zero trust and egalitarian control over cyber property. But then my job is to also posture the United States to be ready to remain a superpower. So if, just like we're already an air power, a naval power, a land power, a space power, we damn well better be a cyber power in the future. We damn well better have the ability to project power to physically prevent denial of service attacks over this cyber property, and to continue to engage in this new protocol, not because we want to or not, but because inevitably other countries are going to figure this out.
Yeah, you're triggering so many questions in my mind right now. I don't even know where to go next. But before I jump to my next question, though, think about what the European Union is trying to do. It's a weird place. I come from Europe, obviously. You look at all of the countries. You look at the European Central Bank. You look at people like Lagarde and others, Bank of England. You can clearly see, and then the World Economic Forum popping out of Davos. You can clearly see people are getting very, very nervous, and they don't want to lose that control. And I think a huge part of this nervousness is stemming from the egalitarian solution that is Bitcoin. Do you believe in that too? That's why there's so much nervousness right now within these leaders in different parts of the world.
Let me put it this way. So why did this Titanic sink? Do you know why? Do you have any ideas?
They were going too fast for the water conditions. They knew an iceberg was there, but they had false sense of security in the technology that they were in.
So the captain was speeding. They were trying to set a new
record,
cross-Atlantic record.
Blue ribbon.
The guy whose job it was to look out for icebergs literally forgot to bring his binoculars with him.
Uh-oh.
The dude who was supposed to be on the radio was asleep. The people were drunk. They had no idea how to, or, a lot of them were. They were definitely not trained on how to evacuate the ship. There wasn't enough lifeboats, even if they were trained. Mm-hmm. So you have a whole bunch of people who, if you looked at these individually, it would look like these were mutually exclusive events that were fully independent, but they were all mutually dependent upon the fact that you mentioned that they all were complacent. They were like the White Star Line had been telling them for years that this was an unsinkable ship. So the risk was mutually correlated, right? Everyone thought it was fine. Imagine how freaking uncomfortable it was for them to realize that the ship is sinking. Okay. So the biggest threat, there's two big threats to safety and security systemically that we have to watch out for. Complacency and success are the two biggest systemic threats. The more successful you are, the more you think that you're not going to sink, right? The more safe you feel, and so that's really bad. We have to fix that. We have to make sure people understand that just because we won the last war doesn't mean we'll win the next war. Just because we were an economic superpower in the past doesn't mean we're guaranteed the future. We have to get rid of this complacency and this happy feeling that we're like the top dogs and really take this seriously. And then recognize that, like, when a new Schelling point emerges, it's going to make you uncomfortable. It's not going to be convenient. You're going to have to give up your strategy, especially national strategic strategy.
Yep. Strategy
means repositioning yourselves, putting yourself in opportunity cost, right? Income, like, it means incurring opportunity costs and making trade-offs, hard trade-offs. If it were easy to just pivot, it wouldn't be strategy. So we must recognize, one, the number one security risk to our country is complacency and success. And two, strategy means you have to give up stuff. You have to take a risk. You have to take opportunity cost and sunken cost, and you have to pivot and you have to reposition yourself, not for what succeeded for the last 250 years, but what will succeed for the next 1,000. And it's clear. It's not even like hard to see if you just do the work to put in the 100 hours, or you are willing to take different viewpoints that don't make that, especially if they make you uncomfortable. Like, imagine how uncomfortable it would be to tell a family on the Titanic that we're going down and you're going to need to, right? Like, so I don't accept this, like, oh man, we're not going to give in to Bitcoin because it's going to be a disadvantage. Like, that disadvantage happens whether you like it or not. The mountain is there whether you like it or not. You don't get to control this. You can only respond.
Embrace or die, sometimes I say as well in the world.
This is the law of nature.
Yep, exactly. So let's switch gears and talk about the importance of the ubiquity of information and the freedom of distribution of information. We've seen a couple of things happen recently. Don't need to mention any places, but lack of electronic banking, SWIFT, treasury seizures, control of internet information, and then you have individuals, Elon Musk, dropping Starlink satellites and direct internet access into a zone that very much needs it. So how do you see all this playing out between private companies playing with satellites in space, ubiquity of information, the importance of that, the partnership with governments going forward, and what is the role of Space Force and everything else? Is a complete sausage of a question there, but I think you know where I'm going.
So let me put it this way. Space Force already has deltas dedicated to SATCOM, to preserving SATCOM. We already have been deploying squadrons into the Middle East to help protect people's SATCOM dishes from being jammed.
When you say delta, so this is what is a delta?
A delta is like the equivalent of a wing in the Air Force. It's like this whole dedicated mission and organization within the Space Force. So it goes Space Force, Space Operations Command, and then that's split up into deltas, and those deltas are separated by their mission sets. So there is actually an entire delta that is satellite communications, making sure that antennas on the ground can talk to satellites in space. So with Elon Musk and Starlink, that's just the same old game that we've been playing for many years. It's nothing new. It's just you're reading about it because it's Elon Musk and it's on Twitter. Right? We already do this.
But the US didn't do what he did.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that goes to your other point. Now commercials are starting to get involved, right? And so you have SpaceX like looking into their own anti-jamming capabilities. So this gets into this like distinction. People like make this distinction that there is a clear boundary and this is military and this isn't. But that already doesn't exist. For example, the Space Force doesn't launch any of its own rockets except for a couple a couple old ICBMs that are launched by the Second Space Launch Squadron out at Delta 30. Every other satellite that we put into orbit is launched there by a commercial company, by SpaceX, by ULA. So we're already in the business of relying exclusively on commercial entities for major mission sets, major military or Space Force mission sets. Just in general, satellite communications and satellite internet, my Delta was part of the Starlink beta. Like Elon went straight to the government and said, this is awesome technology. And he has the government actually subsidize the cost of the development. So like he charges the government way more for Starlink than what he charges the commercial population. So the government is already seeding the development of this technology, recognizing the military implications. You can Google Elon showing some of his first Starlink dishes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So again, it's nothing new. It's just you're seeing it more because of
Twitter.
the national geopolitical. Yeah, but it is It's still that being said, it's still fascinating, right? Isn't it cool? And think about being in the inside SpaceX and like working on this problem. And instead of a blue suiter or instead of an active duty military person working on this, you now have a 22-year-old double E major working on this. It's so interesting to see how the dynamics of power projection and what is commercial and what is military technology changing. But obviously satellite communications and especially space-based internet is going to be a big deal. I don't think it's just going to be internet in the future. I think you're going to see a lot more commercials really taking the lead, commercial companies really taking the lead in what we perceive to be national strategically important military technology.
But is Space Force also there protecting these assets in the sky? Or, there was talk of, I think Russia blew up some satellite in December, and that rattled some cages. But how is Space Force part of that defense mechanism as well? And is that interstellar or up there? Okay.
Yes. Good. So we made a new combatant command called Space Command. So it formally defines space as a combatant, like a geographic combatant command. So there's now a combatant commander who has the authorities to wage war in space. And then once we did that, we stood up Space Force to organize, train, and equip people and stuff to posture those forces or to present those forces to the combatant command for warfighting. So Space Force has a Delta called Delta 9, whose job is to defend assets on orbit from orbit. Just like there's also a Delta dedicated to satellite communications and stopping jamming, there's also a Delta dedicated to protecting and defending assets on orbit from orbit, if you get my drift.
Yeah. So this is something that didn't just happen 2 or 3 years ago when it was announced. This has been in the works for decades, probably. Or was part of the Air Force.
It's been a conversation.
Yeah.
It was a conversation in the Air Force. It was a twinkle in our eye because of the exact same game theory that we've already talked about.
Yep.
If we're not going to defend our assets in space, we necessarily must trust China, Russia, Stan not to denial of service us access to space. So this isn't a question of whether or not we have to do it or we should, or whether it's a threat to our space hegemony. If other countries are beginning to project power and raise new capabilities, the Schelling point is you must respond. If they're building cannons, you got to get cannons. If they're making space forces, you got to make space forces. So Russia, China made space force beside their space forces before we did. That conversation was already happening. These actions were already taking place. It's just what you see is the difference between like what you see and what makes it to the top of Twitter is going to be different than what I see, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, we've already been planning this. It's been a twinkle in our eye. We just needed the go ahead to do it. And again, it wasn't really an option. We don't have the option not to be denial of service attack. We can't vote for China not to do that for us. The only thing we can do is project power to physically prevent them from doing it, or to hopefully, instead of doing that, just simply deter them. Just show them that we have the means, capability, and willingness to stop them so that they don't even try.
Yeah, excellent. And by the way, for the audience out there, I think we've got about 2,500 people watching right now. Please follow Jason P. Lowery on Twitter. And there's a whole bunch of fake people. You've got about 8 fake Jason Lowery's too as well. So just watch that. Make sure you get the P in his name, and the link for his Twitter handle will be down there below as well. Couple more quick questions. This is just a mind-expanding conversation, and I love it. I hope you're enjoying it too. What's your take on central bank digital currencies? Do you believe they are a form of authoritarian control, or do you think governments can work with them, with people? And also related to that, you did mention a Bitcoin-backed CBDC, so it means you are open to the idea. But if you were behind a CBDC, what controls or lack of controls would you put in place?
So when we get to the conversation of CBDC, it's the same conversation as United States dollar in terms of the hazards that exist and the controls that need to be in place to prevent those hazards from occurring, or to prevent the loss events from occurring. So the hazard of a CBDC is it could be used to surveil people. It could be used to denial of service attack people. It could be used to debase people, right? And by doing any of those three, now you're giving people the ability to digitally exit quicker and collapse the value of the network even faster. So those are the hazards. The control structures that need to be in place are to don't let the people who control the CBDCs surveil people or debase people or denial of service attack people. But we've already seen in the United States dollar system that is a demonstrably ineffective control structure. And so maybe it'll get better, maybe it won't. I don't know. I just know that I don't have to trust them because I got my own options. And so I actually, obviously, like, hopefully the United States' version of a CBDC would be better than like a digital yuan. Like, we know how that is going to go.
Oh yeah.
But or Russia's one world, one coin. Like, we know how that's going to be used. Whether or not America can properly put in the control structures to prevent, that's the danger. Is the reason why we can't actually put in these effective control structures to prevent these things from happening is because it's in everyone's best interest to most selfish best interest to put the system in a more hazardous state. So like, people make more money when they pay politicians to deregulate the controls and do all the things that led up to like 2008, for example. Like, people are acting in their rational self-interest, and by doing so, they create a systemic hazard. Mm-hmm. And so that's not going to go away with the CBDC. All of that is going to continue to be the same. It's just literally digital, and it's sure as hell not going to protect you from denial of service attacks. So I personally do not plan on owning a lot of CBDCs. I understand why it would be necessary to be competitive globally. I understand why it would be necessary to increase maybe people's usage of CBDCs or to compete with stablecoins and stuff. Like, I understand all those arguments. I'm just really not really interested in owning a large amount of it myself. But what I would do out of my own selfish best interest is I'll take Bitcoin collateralized CBDC loans all day, every day.
Yeah.
So that way I can spend my CBDCs and run up a CBDC debt that I'd never pay off and keep my full fat stack of Bitcoin to myself so that no one can pry it, not even from my cold dead hands. And I can pass that to my family and just die with a massive worthless CBDC debt. So I'm all about Bitcoin collateralized CBDC loans, just so I don't have to spend my Bitcoin.
Yeah, excellent.
But I probably never use it as my own personal treasury reserve.
So a few very brief questions before we wrap up. I know we've gone long. I can't believe we're here nearly an hour and 15 minutes already. A big thank you to the audience as well for hanging in tough, but this is really a mind-expanding conversation. If you look at Wall Street, the amount that Fidelity is integrated in things like Bitcoin mining and their bag, etc., all the miners, all the activity with VCs and hedge funds, etc., do you think it's too late to put the toothpaste back in the tube, or is Bitcoin unsquashable right now within the US financial system?
I think it would be really hard to squash it at this point.
Yep.
One good thing about slow democracies and slow decision makings is that you can reach critical mass before they can change it. And I think what we're going to see throughout 2022 is more of what we've already started, of politicians pivoting heavily or taking, like, I can't imagine a 2024 election where the presidential candidate that gets like picked isn't pro Bitcoin, just because it's just, so I don't see that going away. But here's the challenge is, and gets back to my thesis, people aren't really smart on the differences between Bitcoin and blockchain. They don't understand the subtle but very important distinction that Bitcoin offers, that zero trust and egalitarian control, the ability to physically prevent denial of service attacks, to literally empower users to stop oppression. That isn't offered by any other cryptocurrency. Well, I guess the other proof of work cryptocurrencies do offer it, but it's like, it's 1,000 times less powerful. So the users are 1,000 times less empowered to protect themselves against denial of service attacks or oppression. And so while I think we'll be definitely pro crypto in the future, I don't know how well people are going to be pro Bitcoin, not blockchain. And that's the problem. And you see it already. You see these supposed technical experts talking about how Dogecoin is going to be better than Bitcoin because it uses less energy, like just totally ignorant about what the power projection apparatus is for and the systemic vulnerabilities that it's specifically designed to protect against. And you see this just blatant ignorance from people like the EU almost banning proof of work because it's too powerful. Okay. And so that part, I don't know. And that's why I'm so passionate and active on trying to make people understand Bitcoin in a different way that will actually defeat that FUD, essentially, that will actually make people understand why proof of work is important and why Bitcoin is unique. It's not just another digital asset in a sea of different digital assets. It has a very, very specific function.
I always say there's only one pristine asset, and that kind of like a follow-on question. I assume you don't follow any other cryptos out there, not Doge, not Ethereum. It's just Bitcoin Maxi, as they call them, but because of the power projection.
I'm not a Bitcoin Maxi.
Yeah,
I don't. You go look on Twitter. I don't get along with the Bitcoin Maxis. Yeah. I am a proof of work Maxi, and it just happens that Bitcoin is by far the largest proof of work system. It's by far the most pristine and most widely adopted proof of work system. So I support proof of work, and then Bitcoin just happens to be the number one proof of work blockchain, if that makes sense.
It does indeed. So how has your chain of command reacted to your thesis of Bitcoin as a defensive measure? Are they coming around to your way of thinking? Are you winning that war? Excuse the pun, because it's really, really hard to convince people. Like I've been unsuccessful convincing family members of Bitcoin.
Yeah. So no one up, down, or sideways laterally has been like, what you're doing is bad. There are a couple of people that say, well, why are you talking about this? Like, why are you wearing a uniform and going on air to talk about Bitcoin as a defense network? Isn't it just a finance network? Like, aren't you just? And so that part, that has come up a bit, but never has it been any strictly anti-Bitcoin thing. It's just been skepticism. It's been, I don't understand, but I'm curious, or it's been die hard. You're doing an amazing job. Keep it up. For my direct superiors, they're literally paying me for my expertise. Like, they told me, don't ask them for permission. Do what you think is right. Study and research the national strategic implications of emerging technology as you see it. You're the National Defense Fellow. You're the Space Force astronautical engineer. You tell me what's important. You tell me what I should be looking out for. And so, and especially in the Air Force, the Department of Air Force, with our chiefs, you have to remember the Air Force was the disenfranchised, like, people didn't think airplanes would be the new weapon of war. Like, literally the supreme commander of World War I, Foch, said, quote, airplanes are interesting toys, but of no military value whatsoever. Wow. And so when people say Bitcoin is an interesting investment or toy or property, but of no military value whatsoever, they're just echoing the same sentiment that happened when airplanes emerged as the new shelling point for property defense. And the people, at least in the United States Air Force, the people who were trained and studied Billy Mitchell and all these people that were disenfranchised and laughed at for years for suggesting that air power is the new way of warfare, would supplement war more so than land and air. They at least take it, like, they're at least willing to indulge me. Let's just put it that way. When I say these radical things, and when I'm like telling these people and these generals, hey, I think Bitcoin is going to be like a huge national strategic priority, they'd be like, oh, that's weird, but I'll take you seriously because I'm, I know what we're paying you for, and I know that how the Air Force was born, or especially on the Space Force, how the Space Force was born, because there ain't nobody in Space Force that isn't used to a bunch of people telling them that they shouldn't be looking into the military implications of weaponizing space.
Interesting. Are you in touch with any other kind of cohorts or groups and other military organizations in other countries around the world, or is this exclusively U.S. Air Force, or are there other groups like what you guys are doing in other parts of the world?
So I don't talk to anyone outside of the United States besides just the people that happen to be outside, like in my class, and if they just ask me about stuff. And I've deliberately, I've been contacted by other government organizations, especially in response to the POTUS executive order, but I'm deliberately not advising them in an official capacity, because if I advise them in an official capacity, I can't talk about what I say. Yep. And so I'm literally dodging that and saying, and basically this conversation that we're having, I'm actually talking to them, but I'm just doing it unofficially to you. And then I'm just going to send them the link, and then they can use that to form their strategic policy. And this has been my intention from the beginning. I just didn't expect, from the time that I started researching this, a war to break out and a POTUS executive order to come out on cryptocurrencies. It's just happening a lot faster than I expected. Exactly. I thought the first conversation would be the thesis, not me awkwardly struggling through these conceptions before I write the thesis. I just don't have enough time.
Yep. Cool. Last question before one final fun question. What do you see happening over the next 10 years with Bitcoin? How do you see it playing out? If you were a betting man.
So we've established that disenfranchised countries that are vulnerable to denial of service attack of their national treasury, are going to be interested in Bitcoin, are going to recognize the value proposition, just like El Salvador did. Now we're starting to establish that these countries can raise sovereign bonds to pay for and seed the development of their hash force. So when you're buying a volcano bond, you're literally paying El Salvador to build a commercial hash force to defend their and the world's access, assuming they don't try a 51% attack, defending people's access to their private property. So I think another disenfranchised third parties country is going to do that, and another country is going to do that, and another country is going to do that, and more and more countries are going to do that, just like the proliferation of any other national defense technology, especially a power projection technology that defends private property. Just like cannons scaled quickly, just like airplanes and tanks and ships scaled quickly, you're going to see disenfranchised countries scale quickly. A lot of Bitcoin on national treasuries, a lot of bond-funded hash forces. And it's really just a matter of how long it takes the superpowers, the ones that have been successful, the ones that are most likely to be vulnerable, like the most likely to be disrupted or whatever. It's just a matter of how long it takes them to pivot, or how long it takes them to decide, maybe I should buy some in case this thing catches on.
Yep. That's amazing. Like what was really the most astounding thing about this conversation between us today is you've identified probably 20 different attack surfaces that trigger the game theory for Bitcoin. You probably never heard that analogy before, but it literally is like all roads, everything points towards this. It's kind of crazy.
I'm an adversarial thinker. So my job is adversarial thinking.
Yeah.
My goal, like every weapon that's ever built, is built to defend against an adversary, against an attacker. And so I'm just doing my job. Like I literally wrote, I've literally used to advise the POTUS on emerging electronic warfare threats. So like, this is nothing new. It's just a different form of this, in my opinion, a different form of the same old technology, one that we should take very seriously, one that we should respect. And especially if we're supposed to be a freedom-loving country that values people's property rights, especially if we're supposed to be an ethical country. Like, I don't want to sit here and listen to bankers tell us that we shouldn't have this technology because it represents a threat to their bags. I'm going to be vocal about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's incredible. Actually, one last thing. I do get this question a lot, but I don't really know how to answer it. A lot of people believe that an EMP could be a massive threat to the Bitcoin network. Do you believe in that thesis? Quick yes or no? And there you go. Fun question.
If your computers go out, turn them back on.
Yep. But like an EMP is not a long sustaining frazzle every ASIC on Earth at the same time. That's impossible.
I mean, I guess it could be possible. Like we used to like look up Project Starfish. The United States has launched nukes into space and like sent off huge EMPs in space. That's how we discovered the Van Allen belts and stuff. Like we fried like the area where the Van Allen belts put particles back on the Earth. So we've looked into that, and I guess there is a weapon powerful enough that could cause that kind of destruction. But like, okay, turn it back on after you break it. It's not permanent. It won't be permanent. So,
yeah, excellent. Now we're nearly at 90 minutes. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy. You got so much work to do, and so many people to talk to. Fun question of the day. I always like to try and end every interview with a fun question. How many Bitcoin do you think it'll cost for Mars citizenship?
For Mars, I think let's say that by 2100 you'll be able to get a ticket to a nice Mars colony. I think maybe half a Bitcoin or less.
Wow.
0.2, no, probably less. 0.25 of a Bitcoin will get you a ride and citizenship and your own little bubble on Mars.
Love it.
It's going to be not a lot compared to what a Bitcoin costs or what a Bitcoin buys today.
Would you ever depart the planet and go to Mars?
I definitely for like, a trip.
Yeah.
If the means is there, sure. I don't know if I'll like live there. It doesn't seem like a very attractive place to live, but to vacation, if we're all super rich because Bitcoin does pan out the way we think it will, yeah, sure. And I'll take a stop at the moon as well. And I'll go take a picture in front of the Eagle site.
Are you concerned? Final question like that. I promise I'll let you go after this one. Are you concerned about kind of in the old world we had what were called the haves and the have-nots? Do you believe the way the projection and the trajectory that Bitcoin is going, it'll cause another world? Those that are late to the game are really going to be left out of the have circle. Are you concerned about those people? Or what would you say to them?
No, I don't think a lot of the problem is associated with the haves and the haves not. I think the problem is associated with the fact that the haves are taking advantage and abusing a systemic control structure where they continue to make themselves the haves while providing not only no value to society, but also harming society. So we're trapped in a rigged game. This is the problem with proof of stake. We're trapped in the rigged game where the haves stay the haves, and that's the problem. And so if we could repivot to where the haves have to provide real meaningful value to society to stay the haves, I think we could dramatically improve the quality of life for the have-nots.
Beautiful. Love that approach. Excellent. With that, don't forget, everybody, link below for Jason Lowery's Twitter feed. Look at his pinned tweet. It is absolutely the most eloquent graphic I've ever seen in my life. I love that work. And a big thank you, Jason. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything you're doing. You're changing lives. You're changing the world, hopefully accelerating the global path to peace as well. So appreciate
Thanks, James. This has been a pleasure.
No,
this has been a pleasure.
All right. And thank you, everybody in the audience as well. See you all soon. Hold on.